A continent-sized silence sits at the bottom of the world, thick enough to swallow radio signals and footsteps alike. Beneath the ice, power is stored. Claims, minerals, roots, leverage, waiting. Antarctica looks peaceful only because the cold enforces a ceasefire. But ice melts, and when it does, the quiet could become the first warning of a future war. On most world maps, Antarctica is drawn as a clean white mass, an afterthought, a borderless blank. In reality, it is the only place on Earth where the usual grammar of power breaks down. No capital city, no parliament, no president, no standing army, no border guards stamping your passport at a checkpoint, no police sirens. The closest thing to a government presence is the hum of generators at research stations and the paperwork filed in distant ministries thousands of kilometers away. That absence is not because Antarctica is irrelevant. It is because it is too important, too dangerous to be owned in the normal way. In the modern international system, land is controlled by sovereignty. A flag goes up, a law goes in, an army arrives, and a state is born onto a piece of geography. Antarctica refuses that script. It is, in the most technical sense, a continent without owners, because the world agreed, under pressure and fear, to treat it as something else. Not a nation-state, not a colony, not a battlefield. At least, not yet. Even its name comes from an older civilization that understood geography as myth before it became strategy. The word Antarctic is rooted in ancient Greek, built around Arctos, the bear, a reference to the constellations in the northern sky, especially Ursa Major, used for navigation. Anti-Arctos, Antarcticos, meant the opposite of the bear, the place opposite the north. A poetic definition for a land no Greek had seen, but whose existence felt mathematically inevitable. If there is a top of the world, there must be a bottom. This is one reason Antarctica haunted maps long before it was touched. Centuries before any human being stood on its rocky shore, cartographers drew a southern land. Sometimes it was huge, sometimes vaguely shaped, sometimes attached to continents that did not exist. It went by names like Terra Australis Incognita, the unknown southern land. The logic was almost philosophical. The northern hemisphere had so much landmass, so surely the south must balance it. So the world's greatest maps carried a ghost continent, a hypothesis-given coastline. This is the first lesson of Antarctic geopolitics. Belief comes before evidence, and maps can be weapons even when they are wrong. When European empires began to dominate oceans, the myth of Terra Australis became more than a curiosity. If a southern continent existed, it could mean ports, trade, whales, seals, and strategic control over the seas. And then came Captain James Cook, one of the first to take the myth seriously enough to challenge it. Between 1772 and 1775, Cook sailed into latitudes where navigation itself becomes a fight against ice, fog, and time. He crossed the Antarctic Circle multiple times, pushing farther south than most humans had ever imagined. Cook did not discover Antarctica in the cinematic sense of planting a flag on land, but he did something more destabilizing. He proved that the imagined warm, habitable Terra Australis of old maps was not there, at least not in the form people wanted. He ran into a barrier of ice, a world that looked like a locked gate. In his wake, the myth collapsed, but a new possibility emerged. There might still be land beyond the ice. And if there was, it would be harsh, remote, and therefore strategically pure. Discovery in Antarctica is never a single moment. It is a chain of sightings, landings, arguments, and national pride. Who really found it first? Even that is disputed. In 1820, multiple expeditions reported seeing what could be the Antarctic mainland. Russian explorer Fabian Gottlieb von Bellingshausen described an ice shore, a sighting some interpret as the first view of the continent. British officer Edward Bransfield and American sealer Nathaniel Palmer also entered the story that same year, each tied to competing narratives of who saw Antarctica first. The fight is not only about history, it is about legitimacy. Because in the Age of Empire, first often became a legal tool. And then there is the question that burns even deeper: who landed first? Claims exist of an 1821 landing associated with Captain John Davis, but the evidence is debated, the geography contested, the ice itself uncooperative as a historical witness. What is more widely cited as the first substantiated landing on the Antarctic continent proper comes much later, 1895, linked to Karsten Borchgrevink and others at Cape Adare. Even here, the word substantiated matters. Antarctica is a place where the archive freezes as easily as water. By the end of the 19th century, Antarctica became the last stage for a certain kind of heroism: exploration as nationalism, suffering as proof, endurance as ideology. This was the heroic age of Antarctic exploration, an era of names that still echo like legends: Shackleton, Scott, Amundsen. Men dragging sledges over white emptiness, living inside storms, writing diaries as if history itself might be lost in the snow. But beneath the romance was a political transformation. Antarctica stopped being an imagined place on old maps and became a real territory in a real world system. And in that system, land is not admired, it is claimed. 7 states drew lines across Antarctica like slices of a circular cake: the United Kingdom, France, Norway, Australia, New Zealand, Chile, and Argentina. Some claims followed meridians down to the South Pole. Others hugged coastlines and mountain ranges. The logic was colonial: proximity, discovery narratives, mapping efforts, and the projection of imperial reach. But Antarctica does not cooperate with straight lines. And so the claims overlapped, especially on the Antarctic Peninsula, the finger of land pointing towards South America, close enough to feel like a natural extension of national space. Here, British, Chilean, and Argentine claims collide, layered on top of each other like transparent flags. Overlap matters because overlap is where law turns into confrontation. It is where a research station can become a statement, a runway can become a message, a map can become provocation. Antarctica's strangest truth is this: it has been claimed, but it is not owned. And it has been militarized in imagination, even while the world publicly insists it is demilitarized in reality. Then came a shadow that still disturbs the Antarctic story. In 1938 to 1939, Nazi Germany sent an expedition to Queen Maud Land. The mission was not only scientific, it was strategic and symbolic. Survey flights crossed the ice. Markers were dropped, aluminum darts emblazoned with swastikas, attempting to inscribe Germany's presence onto a continent that resists inscription. The gesture mattered because it revealed what Antarctica could become: a canvas for ideological empire. After World War II, the planet did not demobilize. It reorganized into a new rivalry, one colder, more systematic. The Cold War turned the world into a chessboard of bases, alliances, surveillance, and influence. And Antarctica, for all its emptiness, was suddenly located in the center of a strategic paranoia. If you can build in the most remote place on Earth, you can build anywhere. If you can operate there, you can project power into the Southern Ocean, control potential routes, monitor missile tests, track satellites, and claim the future. The United States took a peculiar position. It rejected formal territorial claims, refusing to recognize the colonial slicing of the continent. But it also never left. American presence remained persistent, logistical, and expensive, a signal to allies and rivals alike. We may not claim, but we will not be absent. That ambiguity is itself a strategy. The Soviet Union, too, understood the danger. In Antarctica, a research station can be the quietest kind of geopolitical infrastructure. It can justify airfields, fuel depots, communications, and year-round presence, assets that are civilian on paper and strategic in practice. This is why, even when the world speaks about science, it is never only science. And so, in the late 1950s, with the possibility of territorial conflict growing under the ice, the great powers faced a question that sounded impossible. How do you prevent a war over a place with no people, no cities, and no obvious economy? The answer was not morality, it was fear. In 1959, 12 countries signed what became the most unusual international agreement on Earth, the Antarctic Treaty. Its core promise was simple and revolutionary. Antarctica would be used for peaceful purposes only. Scientific investigation would remain free. Cooperation would be encouraged, and the continent would not become a stage for military confrontation. But the treaty's most ingenious and most fragile feature lies in a kind of legal freezing. Article 4 did not erase sovereignty claims. It did not declare anyone right or wrong. Instead, it suspended the argument. It protected every position at once by forbidding actions that would strengthen or weaken claims while the treaty was in force. In other words, the world agreed not to settle the question of ownership. It agreed to postpone it. The flags were not removed. They were placed under glass. This is why Antarctica has no government, army, or police in the conventional sense. The treaty system created a continent governed by consultation and inspection, not by force. Military activity is restricted, but the treaty famously allows military personnel and equipment to be used for scientific or other peaceful purposes. Another ambiguity built into the architecture of stability. The system functions because the most powerful states have, so far, decided that peace in Antarctica is more valuable than conquest. So far. Because treaties do not change geography, they only restrain behavior. And geography is where Antarctica becomes truly explosive. Under the ice is not only rock, it is potential. Oil, gas, minerals, resources that, under different circumstances, would trigger a race. Publicly, Antarctica is a natural reserve, a laboratory, a place of penguins and climate data. But privately, every major power understands that Antarctica is also a vault. Today, extraction is blocked not just by law, but by physics and economics. The environment is lethal. Infrastructure is almost non-existent. The political costs are enormous, and the Antarctic Treaty System, reinforced by the Madrid Protocol of 1991, draws a hard legal line against mineral exploitation. The Madrid Protocol, formerly the Protocol on Environmental Protection, declares Antarctica a natural reserve devoted to peace and science, and it prohibits any activity relating to mineral resources other than scientific research. It is the continent's legal armor, but armor can be tested. The protocol exists because the world, by the late 20th century, realized that Antarctica was not just a strategic space, it was an environmental keystone. The ice holds most of Earth's fresh water. Its currents and winds shape global climate. Its collapse would not remain local. So the mining ban was not merely about protecting Antarctica. It was about protecting a stable planet. And yet, the protocol's durability is tied to politics, not nature. There is a date that haunts every serious conversation about the continent, 2048. That year is often described, sometimes too casually, as a turning point, because of how the Madrid Protocol can be reviewed after 50 years from its entry into force. In a world of rising resource pressure, contested supply chains, and climate driven scarcity, even the idea of review becomes a geopolitical alarm bell. Imagine the world in 2048. Energy transitions may be incomplete. Critical minerals may be even more strategic than oil. Freshwater stress may fuel conflict, sea levels may be higher, and Antarctica's ice, already changing, may expose more accessible coastlines, easier landing zones, longer operating seasons, and new incentives to push against the legal limits that were written for a colder world. Climate change does not only melt ice, it melts restraint. And while mining remains banned, other forms of exploitation are already happening, quietly, legally, and sometimes aggressively. Fishing in the Southern Ocean is one of the most contested frontiers. Antarctic krill, tiny organisms that form the foundation of the marine food chain, have become commercially valuable for aquaculture feed, supplements, and industrial use. Management happens under international mechanisms like CCA/MLR. But consensus is fragile, and geopolitics travels easily across cold water. In recent years, reporting has described China and Russia blocking new marine protected areas and resisting restrictions around krill fishing. Moves that signal how conservation debates can become proxy battles over future rights and influence. Then there is tourism. It looks harmless: a cruise ship, a guided landing, photographs, a brief encounter with the planet's most dramatic landscape. But tourism is also presence. It creates infrastructure. It normalizes access. It builds commercial pathways into a place that was supposed to be reserved for science and peace. Visitor numbers have surged. Industry reporting has documented totals in the hundreds of thousands across seasons, with figures like 122,072 visitors in the 2023 to 24 season, cited in Antarctic Treaty documents related to IAATO reporting. The direction is unmistakable. Antarctica is becoming less unreachable, and presence becomes habit. Habit becomes entitlement. Entitlement becomes politics. Now place China into this landscape. China's Antarctic program has expanded steadily, with multiple stations established over decades: Great Wall, Zhongshan, Kunlun, Taishan, and newer developments reported widely, including international coverage of additional stations. Each station is presented as research, and much of it genuinely is: climate science, astronomy, geology. But in geopolitics, infrastructure is never neutral. Stations create logistics networks. Logistics create strategic endurance. Strategic endurance creates leverage. Antarctica is one of the few places where the phrase peaceful purposes must carry the weight of the entire international order, because there is no police force to enforce it. There is only reciprocity, inspection, and the fear that if one player breaks the spirit of the agreement, others will follow. That is why symbolic acts matter here more than almost anywhere else on Earth. A passport stamp in Antarctica is not legally meaningful in the normal sense. There is no sovereign Antarctic immigration system, and yet stamps exist. Souvenirs, yes, but also signals. A way of implying administration, of turning a visitor into a witness. I was processed here. I was acknowledged here. I crossed something like a border. In a world where sovereignty is often built through rituals, even symbolic control becomes part of the narrative war. So, who controls Antarctica? On paper, no one. In practice, those with the capacity to reach it, build on it, and remain there. Control is measured in icebreakers, aircraft, satellite links, logistics budgets, and diplomatic influence inside the treaty system. It is measured in who can conduct inspections, who can propose rules, who can block them, who can define what science includes, and who can quietly prepare for a world where the rules may change. The Antarctic Treaty prevented war, but it did so by suspending the most explosive question, ownership, and suspensions do not last forever. If the treaty system fractures, Antarctica will not become chaotic like an ungoverned state. It will become something more dangerous, an unclaimed strategic prize in a world that has learned to compete without formal declarations. Power could arrive disguised as research, logistics, environmental monitoring, search and rescue, or emergency response. Bases could expand without ever calling themselves bases. Dual-use technology could be justified as safety. The first militarization might not look like troops marching. It might look like antennas, runways, and hardened fuel tanks. And beneath it all, the ice will keep thinning. Not evenly, not politely, but enough to change the cost-benefit calculation for extraction, shipping, and presence. The continent's hidden wealth is not only oil and gas, not only minerals, not only fish. The real wealth is the future, the ability to shape global rules in the last untouched space. Whoever dominates the governance of Antarctica does not just gain resources. They gain moral authority, scientific prestige, and strategic depth, advantages that compound over decades. Which brings us back to 2048, not as a magic date when the world suddenly rushes south, but as a psychological trigger, a deadline that invites planning. A year that makes every construction project, every new station, every diplomatic obstruction, every scientific mission feel like preparation. Because when a ceasefire is written into law, the smartest players do not rush to break it. They position themselves so that if it breaks, they are already standing on the ice. And if the silence at the bottom of the world is only temporary, if Antarctica is peaceful only because the cold makes conflict inconvenient, then the real question is not who controls Antarctica today. It is who is preparing to control it tomorrow, and what will they be willing to risk when the ice finally stops protecting the agreement.